My backup generator kicked on before sunrise, growling so hard the kitchen lights flickered once and died. Outside my fence, an HOA landscaping crew stood over a fresh trench where my underground power line had been cut clean through. Patricia Morgan pointed at the exposed cable and told the foreman to keep working. That line fed my house, my workshop, and the protected utility easement running behind 3 streets of her subdivision. A transformer beyond the tree line gave a low, unstable hum. Then one of her workers covered the cut with wet dirt like burying it would make the problem disappear. They had not cut a wire. They had touched the wrong part of the grid. Diesel exhaust rolled from the generator shed as I crossed the yard in my boots. The morning air smelled like mud, hot metal, and fresh cut sod. My coffee sat forgotten on the porch rail, already cooling in the gray light. Beyond the fence, Patricia stood in a cream-colored jacket, spotless white sneakers, and sunglasses too large for dawn. She looked like she had dressed for a ribbon cutting, not a utility damage scene. "You cannot run industrial equipment through HOA property," she said. Her voice was sharp enough to stop the crew from moving. The foreman looked at me, then looked down at the cable. He knew enough to be nervous. "My name is Cole Bennett. I am an industrial electrical engineer. I own the 5-acre parcel behind Oak Ridge Estates, including the utility easement that crosses the back line before feeding into the subdivision's service corridor." That sentence sounds boring until somebody takes a trencher to it. I stopped 6 feet from the fence and looked at the orange utility marker lying face down in the dirt. Someone had pulled it out before the digging started. The stake still had wet clay stuck to the bottom. That was not accidental. Patricia unfolded a printed notice and held it against the fence. "You were warned," she said. "The board voted to remove unauthorized lines from common visual areas." I looked past her shoulder. A contractor's mini excavator sat beside the trench. Its bucket teeth were packed with black soil. The machine was still warm. The engine clicked as it cooled. Behind it, 2 HOA board members watched from a golf cart. Neither one spoke. That silence carried weight. "Who authorized excavation here?" I asked. Patricia tapped the paper with one manicured finger. "The HOA did." The generator behind me surged again. My workshop lights tried to come back, then failed. Across the road, a porch light blinked on one of the subdivision homes. Then it flickered twice. Patricia did not notice. I did. So did the foreman. His eyes moved toward the transformer at the edge of the easement. The hum had changed pitch. Lower now. Rougher. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Patricia smiled like I had just handed her proof of my own guilt. "Good," she said. "Document that you are interfering with community improvement." I kept the camera on the trench. The cut jacket on the cable was visible through the mud. So was the red warning tape beneath the surface. Whoever dug here had gone straight through 2 layers of utility marking. That required effort. Or arrogance. The first neighbor stepped onto his back patio with a flashlight. Then another. Farther down the street, a garage door stalled halfway open and stopped with a loud metallic jerk. Patricia finally turned her head. Her smile faded by half an inch. The foreman took 1 step away from the trench. He understood before she did. This was no longer my outage. The foreman shut down the excavator 5 minutes later. The sudden silence felt louder than the machine. Wind pushed loose dirt across the trench. The exposed cable sat in the morning light like a warning nobody wanted to read. Patricia folded her notice and tucked it beneath her arm. She acted calm, but she had stopped smiling. That mattered. The neighbors noticed it too. More people were standing outside now. Coffee mugs. Bathrobes. Cell phones. A few of them stared toward the transformer beyond the easement. The humming sound had become uneven. I stepped closer to the trench and crouched beside the cut line. The soil was still damp. Fresh track marks crossed the grass and disappeared toward the subdivision maintenance gate. I pointed my camera at the ground and took photographs. Tire tracks. Utility marker. Excavator. Bucket. Every detail mattered. Patricia watched me for a moment. Then she looked at the foreman. "Finish the landscaping plan," she said. The man did not move. His jaw tightened. He glanced at the cable again. "Ma'am, I think we should call the utility company." Patricia's expression hardened immediately. "This is HOA property." The foreman looked like he wanted to disagree. Instead, he climbed into his truck and drove away without another word. That was the first person to walk away from her all morning. I followed the utility corridor behind my property fence. The grass was wet from overnight dew. The smell of diesel from my generator drifted through the trees. About 200 feet farther down the easement, I found another problem. One of the orange warning stakes was missing. The ground around it had been disturbed recently. Boot prints crossed the soft soil. Someone had walked the route before the excavation started. I photographed everything. Then I found something even more useful. A small strip of bright survey tape tied to a branch. The tape carried the logo of a local landscaping contractor. Not a utility contractor. Not an engineering company. A landscaping contractor. The kind Patricia hired every spring for community projects. My phone buzzed. The utility monitoring app connected to my workshop system had sent a new alert. Voltage fluctuations detected. I opened the report and watched the numbers update. The readings were getting worse. Not better. A cold breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere across the subdivision, another garage door stalled halfway during its cycle. A dog started barking. Then another. Small signs. Small failures. Systems always talk before they break. Most people never listen. By late morning, a white pickup from the power company finally arrived. 2 utility technicians stepped out carrying equipment cases. Their reflective vests flashed in the sunlight. Patricia immediately walked toward them holding her HOA paperwork. The older technician listened for less than 30 seconds. Then he looked directly at the trench. His expression changed. He crossed the distance quickly and stopped beside the exposed cable. The younger technician followed. Neither one touched anything at first. They simply looked. The older technician slowly exhaled through his nose. Then he asked a question Patricia clearly did not expect. Who authorized excavation inside this easement? The silence afterward felt heavier than the trench itself. Then the technician noticed something else. The older technician walked past Patricia without waiting for an answer. His boots crunched across the loose dirt beside the trench. He stopped near the missing utility marker and stared at the ground for several seconds. The younger technician followed his gaze. Neither of them spoke immediately. That silence caught everyone's attention. A few neighbors moved closer. Someone lowered a phone that had been recording. Even Patricia seemed unsure whether to interrupt. The older technician finally pointed toward the disturbed soil. "Where is the second marker?" he asked. Nobody answered. The morning sun was higher now. Heat shimmered above the exposed trench. The smell of fresh dirt mixed with diesel exhaust from my generator. The technician crouched and brushed away loose soil with his glove. A narrow strip of orange warning tape appeared beneath the surface. Then another. He looked up at his partner. That should have stopped excavation before the first bucket touched ground. Patricia crossed her arms. The HOA was removing unauthorized infrastructure. The younger technician slowly shook his head. This is not how utility corridors work. Patricia opened her folder again, searching for confidence inside a stack of papers. The older technician stood and looked beyond my property. His eyes followed the easement through a line of trees toward the subdivision. Then he looked back at the trench. I recognized that expression. Engineers make that face when they start seeing the whole system instead of a single problem. My phone buzzed again. Another voltage alert. The numbers were dropping faster now. I showed the screen to the younger technician. He studied the readings for a moment. Then his jaw tightened. That explains it. Patricia immediately stepped forward. Explains what? Neither technician answered. Instead, they opened one of their equipment cases. Cables. Test instruments. Mapping tools. Serious equipment. Not the kind used for a simple residential repair. The neighbors noticed too. Their conversations became quieter. A woman across the street looked toward her porch light even though it was daytime. People were beginning to sense something larger. The older technician connected a testing device to an access point near the easement. A low electronic tone echoed from the unit. He checked the screen. Then checked it again. The younger technician stepped closer. Neither one looked happy. That alone told me enough. About 30 minutes later, another truck arrived. Then another. Utility vehicles lined the road outside my property. Orange safety lights flashed in the sunlight. Patricia's confidence continued shrinking with each arrival. A board member quietly left the golf cart and disappeared back toward the subdivision. The technicians began placing temporary markers along the corridor. Bright orange flags appeared every few yards. One of them stopped near the edge of the HOA entrance road and planted a marker directly beside a decorative stone sign. Residents watched from their driveways. Questions spread faster than answers. Then something unexpected happened. A landscaping worker pulled his truck onto the shoulder and walked toward me. He looked over both shoulders before speaking. Dirt covered his boots. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. I think you need to see this, he said quietly. He handed me a folded work order from his pocket. Patricia's signature was on the bottom of the page. Then I noticed the date. The date on the work order was 12 days before the trench was dug. I read it twice. Then a third time. The paper crackled in my hand as a warm breeze moved across the easement. The landscaping worker kept glancing toward Patricia. He looked nervous. We were told the utility markers were old property stakes, he said quietly. Nobody told us they marked active infrastructure. Behind him, another utility truck rolled onto the shoulder. Orange warning lights flashed against the windows of nearby homes. Patricia was still speaking with the technicians. But her voice sounded different now. Less certain. More defensive. I folded the work order and slipped it into my pocket. The worker pointed toward a line near the bottom of the page. That section bothered me. I unfolded it again. A handwritten note had been added beneath the landscaping instructions. Remove visual utility obstructions along community boundary. The wording was careful. Too careful. The utility marker had been labeled an obstruction. Not infrastructure. Not a warning device. An obstruction. That choice of words mattered. The older technician walked over before I could ask another question. He held a tablet in one hand. His expression remained neutral, but his pace had quickened. We found something, he said. The landscaping worker immediately stepped back. I followed the technician toward the utility vehicles parked along the road. Several screens displayed corridor maps and service diagrams. Colored lines stretched beneath the subdivision like a web. The technician zoomed in on the easement. Then farther out. Then farther still. My eyes followed the route. The corridor extended beyond my property. Beyond the HOA entrance. Beyond several residential blocks. The younger technician pointed to a junction highlighted in red. This is why the voltage alarm started spreading. The low hum from the transformer drifted across the trees again. This time it sounded strained. One of the utility employees spoke into a radio. Another reviewed a maintenance database. Activity was increasing by the minute. Around us, neighbors continued gathering. A woman stood beside her mailbox with a flashlight even though it was midday. People sense instability long before they understand it. Patricia finally approached the group. Her heels clicked against the pavement. I would like to know why utility personnel are mapping HOA property. The older technician turned the tablet toward her. We are mapping utility infrastructure. Patricia crossed her arms. That line serviced his property. Nobody answered immediately. The younger technician looked up from the screen. Not just his property. Patricia's expression froze. A long silence followed. Even the neighbors stopped talking. The wind rustled leaves along the easement. Somewhere down the street, an air conditioning unit shut off unexpectedly. Then another. Small sounds. Small warnings. The older technician tapped the highlighted junction again. We need additional records before making conclusions. Patricia seized on those words immediately. So you are not sure? The technician did not argue. He simply looked at the work order sticking out of my pocket. Then he looked back at the trench. His eyes lingered on the exposed cable. Something in the system was finally connecting. Then a county utility inspector stepped out of a newly arrived vehicle. The county utility inspector closed the door of his vehicle and walked straight toward the trench. He carried a weathered clipboard under one arm and a thick folder in the other. The afternoon sun reflected off his safety glasses. Nobody spoke as he approached. Even Patricia stepped aside. The inspector stopped at the edge of the excavation and studied the exposed cable for nearly a full minute. Wind moved through the grass along the easement. Somewhere behind the subdivision, a transformer gave another uneven hum. The inspector finally looked up. How long has this line been exposed? One of the technicians answered. Patricia did not. That detail caught my attention. The inspector made a note on his clipboard and walked farther down the corridor. Every few yards he stopped to compare physical markers against records in his folder. The technicians followed closely behind. More utility trucks arrived throughout the afternoon. Orange cones appeared near the roadside. Temporary warning signs went up beside the easement. Residents gathered in small groups near driveways and mailboxes. Nobody seemed interested in HOA notices anymore. Everyone was watching the utility crews. Around 3 o'clock, I returned to my workshop and pulled up archived corridor maps stored on my computer. The generator continued rumbling outside. Its steady vibration traveled through the floorboards. I compared the digital records to the route the inspector was tracing. The alignment matched perfectly. Every marker. Every junction. Every service branch. Then I noticed something new. One section of the corridor connected to a distribution point located near the center of Oak Ridge Estates. I zoomed in closer. The connection was older than most of the homes. Much older. My phone rang before I could study it further. It was one of the utility technicians. His voice sounded rushed. Can you bring your corridor maps? I grabbed the printed copies and drove back toward the easement. The scene had changed again. A temporary operations tent stood beside the road. Folding tables held maps, laptops, and testing equipment. The county inspector was speaking with 2 engineers I had not seen before. One of them pointed repeatedly toward the subdivision. The other kept reviewing maintenance records. I handed over my maps. The older technician spread them across a table and compared them against official utility diagrams. Several minutes passed. Nobody said much. Pages turned. Screens refreshed. Radios crackled. Then one engineer tapped a location near the center of the neighborhood. The county inspector immediately leaned closer. The technician beside him slowly removed his glasses. That reaction told me they had found something important. Patricia arrived moments later with 2 HOA board members. Her expression suggested she expected answers. Instead, she found more questions. The inspector asked for HOA maintenance records. Then landscaping contracts. Then excavation approvals. Patricia's confidence slipped another notch. She promised to provide everything. The inspector simply nodded and wrote another note. A sudden pop echoed somewhere in the distance. Several residents turned toward the subdivision entrance. A row of decorative streetlights flickered once. Then twice. The lights recovered after a few seconds, but the message was clear. The instability was spreading. The engineers exchanged looks. Nobody appeared surprised. Then the oldest engineer unfolded a map that had not been on the table before. The oldest engineer spread the newly unfolded map across the table and weighed the corners down with a flashlight and 2 radios. A warm wind moved through the operations tent. Papers fluttered softly. Everyone leaned closer. The map was older than the others. The edges were yellowed. Several notes had been added by hand decades earlier. The engineer traced a line with his finger. It began outside my property. It crossed the easement. Then it continued directly beneath Oak Ridge Estates. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The county inspector adjusted his glasses and studied the markings again. One of the utility technicians let out a slow breath. Patricia looked from face to face, waiting for someone to explain why the map suddenly mattered. The engineer tapped a boxed section near the center of the subdivision. This is the original service route. His voice was calm. Professional. The inspector nodded. Another technician opened a laptop and compared the map against modern utility records. Screen after screen filled with diagrams and service data. The more they compared, the quieter the tent became. Outside, residents stood behind temporary barriers watching the activity. Children pointed at utility trucks. Neighbors whispered to each other. Across the road, the decorative streetlights flickered again. This time they stayed dim for several seconds before recovering. A few people noticed. More importantly, the engineers noticed. The older engineer pointed to a second notation buried in the corner of the map. It referenced an infrastructure modification completed years earlier. He turned to the inspector. That explains the corridor dependency. The inspector immediately asked for additional records. Radios crackled. Calls were made. Within 30 minutes, another set of files arrived electronically. The technician reviewing them sat up straighter almost immediately. He enlarged a diagram and rotated the screen toward the group. Several colored lines converged at a single distribution point. My eyes followed the routes. So did Patricia's. Her expression changed. Not panic. Not yet. But uncertainty had finally arrived. The distribution point sat beyond my workshop, directly along the protected corridor where the excavation had occurred. The engineers began speaking in shorter sentences. Technical language. Service balancing. Load routing. Emergency redundancy. The details mattered because the system was larger than most residents realized. The line that had been damaged was never isolated. It connected to a network designed decades earlier. A network still carrying responsibilities nobody in the HOA appeared to understand. Around sunset, utility crews began placing additional monitoring equipment throughout the neighborhood. Portable testing units appeared near sidewalks and transformer cabinets. Orange flags marked access points along several streets. The neighborhood looked less like a subdivision and more like an active infrastructure project. Patricia spent most of the evening making phone calls. Each conversation seemed shorter than the last. Several board members stopped answering questions from residents altogether. The confidence that had filled the morning was gone. In its place was confusion. The generator outside my workshop continued running steadily. Its engine echoed through the evening air. I stood beside the operations tent watching engineers compare records from different decades. Then the county inspector received a document he had been waiting for all day. He read the first page. Turned to the second. Then he looked directly at the damaged corridor on the map. Something important had finally matched. The county inspector held the document in both hands while the last light of the day faded behind the trees. Portable work lights had been switched on around the operations tent. Their white glow reflected off trucks, safety cones, and stacks of equipment cases. The neighborhood felt different now. Quieter. More cautious. Residents still gathered along the sidewalks, but most conversations had dropped to whispers. Everyone could tell something important was happening. The inspector placed the document beside the old corridor map and called the senior engineer over. Both men studied the pages together. Then they compared them to the digital records on the laptop. One page. Then another. The engineer slowly nodded. A utility technician nearby stopped typing and turned his chair toward the table. Whatever they had found was no longer a theory. It was becoming a conclusion. Patricia stepped closer. What exactly is going on? Her voice was steady, but the confidence was fading. The inspector did not answer immediately. He finished reviewing the final page before setting the document down. We are verifying infrastructure dependency routes. Patricia looked frustrated. It was not the answer she wanted. The engineer pointed toward the highlighted junction shown on the map. This corridor supports more than a single service connection. Several nearby residents heard that statement. A murmur moved through the crowd. Patricia immediately tried to respond. The HOA was told those lines serviced private property. The inspector glanced at the work order still sitting on the table. The records suggest otherwise. That sentence landed harder than any argument could have. The wind picked up. Leaves rustled along the easement. Across the subdivision, another row of decorative streetlights dimmed briefly before returning to normal. More residents noticed this time. Several people pulled out phones. Others walked toward their front porches and looked at exterior fixtures. The engineers continued working. Testing equipment fed live data into the monitoring systems. Screens updated every few seconds. Colored indicators shifted across digital maps. The technician who had first reviewed the corridor records called another utility office and requested archived maintenance files. His tone was calm but urgent. Around 8 o'clock, the files arrived. Hundreds of pages. Inspection reports. Upgrade records. Routing diagrams. The operations tent grew busier. Coffee cups appeared. Radios remained active. Nobody looked like they expected to leave soon. I stood near the edge of the easement watching the process unfold. The generator behind my workshop still provided power, but the rest of the neighborhood depended on a system that was now under intense scrutiny. That distinction was becoming impossible to ignore. Patricia spent most of the evening moving between board members and residents. Questions followed her everywhere. Some were polite. Some were not. For the first time, she had fewer answers than the people around her. Then the senior engineer found the file everyone had been searching. 4. He opened it carefully and compared it to the original corridor map. The county inspector leaned over his shoulder. Both men focused on a single page. The engineer tapped a paragraph halfway down. The inspector read it once. Then again. Neither spoke for several seconds. The silence inside the tent spread quickly. Then the inspector picked up his radio and requested emergency review authorization. The emergency review authorization changed everything. The request went through just before midnight. Radios came alive across the operations tent. Engineers began moving faster. New vehicles arrived within the hour. Their headlights swept across the easement and illuminated the damaged corridor like a crime scene made entirely of paperwork and utility equipment. Nobody was shouting. Nobody needed to. The urgency was obvious. I stood near my workshop listening to the steady rumble of the generator. The sound had become strangely comforting. Beyond the fence, technicians installed additional monitoring devices along the route. Small indicator lights blinked red and green in the darkness. Every few minutes another set of readings appeared on the laptops. The numbers were not improving. Around 1 in the morning, the county inspector gathered several engineers around the oldest map. They compared it against the maintenance file discovered earlier. One section kept drawing their attention. The same section that crossed the damaged corridor. The same section connected to the distribution point beneath Oak Ridge Estates. Patricia remained nearby with 2 exhausted board members. The confidence that had carried her through the morning was gone completely now. She looked tired. Frustrated. Every answer she wanted seemed trapped inside documents she had never bothered to read. Just before dawn, the review team reached a conclusion. The senior engineer walked directly to the inspector and handed him a written assessment. The inspector read it slowly. Then he signed the bottom page. The morning sky was beginning to brighten. Birds started calling from the trees. Residents emerged from their homes carrying coffee cups and questions. Utility crews placed temporary notices at several key access points throughout the neighborhood. The notices were simple. Technical. Official. Nobody needed legal language to understand what they meant. A controlled service interruption would be required to stabilize and repair the damaged corridor. Word spread through Oak Ridge Estates in less than 30 minutes. Conversations erupted across sidewalks and driveways. People stared at the notices. Others stared at the trench. Many stared directly at Patricia. She tried explaining the situation. The explanations sounded smaller each time she repeated them. By mid-morning, utility crews had established work zones around the distribution point and along multiple streets. Bright orange barriers appeared throughout the subdivision. Engineers reviewed repair sequences. Technicians verified routing options. The neighborhood felt like a living machine being carefully dismantled for surgery. Then the interruption began. It was not dramatic. No sparks. No explosions. Just a sequence of planned shutoffs moving through the system. One block lost power. Then another. Air conditioners fell silent. Decorative fountains stopped flowing. Garage doors froze in place. The decorative streetlights that had flickered for hours finally went dark. A strange stillness settled over the subdivision. Residents stepped outside and looked around. The silence felt larger than the neighborhood itself. My workshop remained powered by the generator. The low diesel rhythm echoed across the property. Utility crews continued working methodically. Nobody appeared surprised by the outage. They had expected it. The damaged corridor left them no safe alternative. Patricia stood beside the community entrance sign watching darkened homes stretch into the distance. The realization on her face arrived slowly. Not when the lights went out. Not when residents started complaining. It arrived when the senior engineer handed the county inspector the final repair estimate. The senior engineer handed the county inspector the final repair estimate and stepped back from the table. The inspector read every page without rushing. Morning sunlight reflected off the operations tent. Utility crews continued. Moving through the subdivision with steady precision. Trucks rolled slowly between work zones. Equipment hummed. Radios crackled. Nobody treated the situation like an emergency anymore. The investigation phase was over. Now came the consequences. Patricia stood a few feet away with her arms folded tightly across her chest. She watched the inspector turn the final page. Then he signed it. The sound of his pen against the paper seemed louder than it should have. One of the HOA board members quietly walked away. Another stared at the ground. The estimate did not just describe repairs. It described why the repairs were necessary. It documented the damaged corridor, the removed markers, the unauthorized excavation, the maintenance records, the work order. Every piece fit together. Residents began asking questions faster than the board could answer them. Some wanted to know how the digging was approved. Others wanted to know why warning markers were removed. The conversation spread from driveway to driveway. By afternoon, repair crews began restoring portions of the system. One section at a time. Carefully. Methodically. The process took hours. Every connection had to be verified. Every route had to be tested. Temporary equipment lined the easement behind my property. Orange flags still marked the corridor. The same corridor Patricia had called an obstruction. Around sunset, the first restored section came back online. A row of homes lit up. Porch lights returned. Air conditioners started humming again. Residents applauded from across the street. Not because they were celebrating the HOA. They were celebrating stability. The following week brought more changes. New utility markers were installed along the corridor. Larger ones. Impossible to miss. Additional protective barriers appeared near critical access points. The county inspector returned twice. Engineers returned 3 times. Every visit added another layer of documentation. Every document told the same story. The damaged corridor had never been a private inconvenience. It had always been part of a larger system. The landscaping company cooperated fully. Their records matched the work order. The work order matched the excavation date. The excavation matched the damaged line. Facts connected themselves. They did not need help. By the end of the month, the subdivision looked normal again. The lights worked. The streets were quiet. The temporary barriers disappeared. Utility crews moved on to other projects. Even the operations tent was gone.